I never thought the day I finally decided to rent out my apartment would become the turning point of my life. For months, I had been considering it, not because I desperately needed the money, but because after my work transfer to another city, the place had been sitting empty. I thought, why let such a beautiful space go to waste when it could be earning me something? It wasn't just any apartment either. It was the place I had worked my fingers to the bone to afford. The one thing in my life I could look at and say, this is mine. Every tile, every wall, every view from the window. I paid for it with my sweat and sleepless nights. I had carefully painted it myself, picked out every piece of furniture, and poured my personality into every corner. I was attached to it in ways I can't fully explain. And that's why I wanted to make sure that if I ever rented it out, would be two people who respected homes, people who wouldn't treat it like just another place to crash. After a lot of thinking and listing it online, I finally found what seemed like the perfect tenants, a young married couple, polite, financially stable, and with the kind of warm manners that made me think, yes, they'll take care of my apartment like I would. The arrangement was simple. I'd meet them at the apartment for a final viewing before we signed the lease. That morning, I woke up feeling both nervous and excited. I packed the necessary papers, grabbed the spare keys, and drove to the building, rehearsing in my mind how I'd show them around the balcony with the stunning sunset view, the cozy bedroom, the little breakfast nook by the kitchen window. But when we arrived and stepped into the hallway, I noticed something strange. The door to my apartment, which I had locked the last time I visited, was slightly ajar. My first thought was that maybe the maintenance guy had come in for some repair work, but I hadn't requested anything. I pushed the door open slowly, the tenants trailing behind me, curious but silent. And there, standing in the middle of my living room, were two people I knew better than anyone else, my sister and her fiancé. At first I froze, my brain refusing to piece together why they were there, why my sister was holding my coffee mug like she lived there, why her fiancé had his shoes kicked off near the couch. The tenants looked at me, puzzled, clearly sensing something was wrong. My sister's eyes widened in shock when she saw me, her mouth opening slightly as if she'd been caught doing something she knew she shouldn't. Her fiancé, on the other hand, straightened his posture, a mix of defiance and embarrassment on his face. "What are you doing here?" I asked slowly, my voice tight. She stammered, glancing at him, then back at me. We've been staying here for a while." My stomach twisted. Staying here, without asking, without telling me. I took a step closer, feeling the tenants' presence behind me, like witnesses to a crime. My sister began fumbling for explanations, something about their apartment being renovated, something about it being just for a few weeks, but all I could hear was the roaring in my ears, the realization that my own flesh and blood had been living in my home behind my back, as if I were a stranger. And worse, there was something in her fiancé's smirk, in the way he avoided eye contact, that made me suspect there was more to this than she was saying. The couple who had come to rent my apartment glanced at each other, clearly uncomfortable, and I could sense they were wondering whether they had just walked into some kind of family dispute they didn't want to be part of. I couldn't even blame them. It was a family dispute, but not the kind anyone could have prepared for. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and a heat was spreading through my chest, the kind that comes right before anger takes over. I turned to my sister, my voice sharper now, without asking me, without even a text. "This is my home, Sarah, my home." Her eyes dropped to the floor, but her fiancé's didn't, in fact. He took a step forward like he wanted to assert himself in the situation, and his voice came out slick and almost mocking. "Well, technically, it was just sitting here. Empty. We figured you wouldn't mind for a little while. Family helps family, right?" That last sentence was laced with a tone that made my skin crawl, like he was daring me to object. The audacity of it hit me like a slap. Family helps family. They had helped themselves to my place, without permission, without respect, without even the courtesy of letting me know. I took in the scene, my couch cushions slightly sagging as if they'd been slept on, my books scattered on the coffee table, a half-empty wine bottle in the kitchen, my neatly folded throws now bunched up on the floor. And then, I saw something that made my stomach drop even further. My jewelry box, the one I kept on the sideboard in the hallway, was open, and several pieces I knew were there last time were missing. My gaze shot to my sister, and for a brief moment, she looked away, her face pale. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to speak evenly, because the tenants were still there. "I think you two should leave," I said, my tone low but firm. Sarah tried to protest, her voice shaky. Please, it's just until next week. We don't have anywhere, but I cut her off. You've already overstayed whatever welcome you imagined you had. Get your things and go. Her fiancé chuckled under his breath, muttering something about me overreacting and being dramatic, which only added fuel to the fire simmering inside me. I turned to the tenants and apologized quietly, explaining there had been a misunderstanding and that we'd have to reschedule. They nodded awkwardly, clearly eager to leave this uncomfortable scene, and I walked them out, my mind already racing ahead, because in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about them squatting in my apartment. This was about betrayal, my own sister siding with a man who thought he could take advantage of me, use my hard work for his comfort, and walk away without consequences. And as I locked the door behind the departing tenants, I made a silent promise to myself. This wasn't going to end with them packing their bags. I was going to make sure they regretted ever thinking they could cross me. The moment the tenants disappeared down the hallway, the tension inside the apartment thickened like smoke after a fire. I turned back to my sister and her fiancé, were now standing with their arms crossed, both wearing expressions that hovered somewhere between guilt and arrogance. Sarah's eyes darted toward the jewelry box again, and I noticed her hand twitch slightly, a small, nervous habit she'd had since childhood whenever she was caught doing something wrong. My anger was no longer a sudden flare-up. It had settled into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. I closed the door slowly, the lock clicking into place, sounding almost symbolic, like sealing us inside for the truth to come out. Sit, I told them, my voice controlled but brooking no argument. Her fiancé scoffed, but he sat anyway, sprawling lazily on my couch as if daring me to kick him out. Sarah perched on the edge, her knees close together, fingers gripping each other tightly. Start talking, I said, my eyes moving between them. How long have you been here? And don't bother lying, I'll find out. Sarah hesitated, then muttered, a little over a month. My jaw tightened. A month. That meant they'd been here every time I thought the apartment was empty, every time I'd told friends I missed the place, every time I'd worried about paying the utility bills for a space no one was using. Her fiancé leaned forward, speaking for her like he was in charge. We didn't think it was a big deal. You weren't using it, and we were in a bind. His tone dripped with entitlement, and I could almost see the calculation in his eyes, the belief that because I was family, I'd just roll over and let them take advantage of me. But what really made my blood run cold was when Sarah added quietly, we were going to tell you, but we didn't know how you'd react. That was all the confirmation I needed that she knew it was wrong, and yet she'd gone along with it anyway. I got up and walked toward the kitchen, not because I needed anything, but because I didn't want them to see the fury in my face just yet. My mind was already spinning with possibilities: legal eviction, calling the police, exposing them to the rest of the family. But none of those felt satisfying enough. This wasn't just about reclaiming my space. It was about making them understand the weight of their betrayal in a way they'd never forget. I turned back to them, leaning against the counter, and said in a voice so calm it almost scared me, you've made a mistake you can't take back. And I'm not going to forget it, ever. Sarah's face paled even more, while her fiancé smirked, clearly underestimating me. That smirk was going to be the last time he ever thought he could outplay me. I decided then that I'd let them think they'd gotten away with it, for now. Because the best revenge isn't loud, it's patient, and it comes when they least expect it. I didn't tell them to leave that night. That was part of the plan. Instead, I let them believe that my anger had burned itself out, that I was too exhausted to keep fighting. I walked around the apartment in silence, picking up my belongings with an expression that was unreadable on purpose. The truth was, inside me, a blueprint for payback was already forming, each detail sharper than the last. I asked them casually what their renovation timeline was, as if I were considering letting them stay until it was done. Sarah's shoulders loosened a little, and her fiancé leaned back smugly, thinking they'd won the battle. 2 more weeks, maybe, he said, his tone dripping with fake gratitude. I just nodded and muttered, all right. I could feel Sarah studying my face, probably trying to gauge if I was serious. What she didn't know was that I'd already sent a quick text in the hallway to my friend Lucas, who happened to work in property management and was as protective of me as a brother. He knew people, and more importantly, He knew the right kind of people who could make life very, very uncomfortable for tenants who had no legal right to be there. But I wasn't going to throw them out in a scene that would make me look like the villain to my family. No, I wanted evidence, undeniable proof of their disrespect and selfishness. I started planting small traps. That night, while they were out, I knew they'd go out because the wine bottle had been emptied and the cork tossed carelessly on my counter. I came back with a set of discreet security cameras and hid them in strategic spots: the corner of the living room, above the kitchen shelf, and in the hallway facing the bedroom door. I even tucked a tiny audio recorder inside the drawer near the couch. I wanted to know exactly how they talked about me when I wasn't around. Within days, the footage told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just living there for convenience, they were hosting friends, throwing small gatherings, and worse, they'd been pawning some of my belongings. The jewelry I'd noticed missing, sold, some of my high-end cookware, gone. They laughed about how uptight I was, how I'd never notice if a few things disappeared. I watched the videos late at night, my hands trembling with both rage and grim satisfaction. They had no idea I was watching every move, no idea that every careless laugh, every disrespectful comment, was adding another brick to the wall I was going to crush them with. And while they relaxed, thinking I'd softened, I started pulling financial strings behind the scenes, contacting their landlord about possible lease fraud, reaching out to my cousin who worked in a small local newspaper about a story on entitled squatters, and slowly gathering allies who would make sure when I struck, it wouldn't just push them out of my apartment, it would stain their reputations in ways they could never wash cleaned up by the end of the first week. The pieces of my plan were sliding into place so neatly that even I was impressed with myself. They still thought I'd moved on, that I'd chosen the mature route of letting bygones be bygones, but every polite smile I gave them was another stitch in the net I was weaving around them. From the cameras, I learned their routines: when they left for errands, when they argued, even when they whispered about me late at night. Sarah's guilt was starting to show. She'd sigh more often, avoid mentioning me in certain conversations, and sometimes glance nervously toward the door, as if expecting me to burst in. Her fiance, on the other hand, had grown bolder. He began inviting his friends over during the day, loud, careless men who tracked dirt on my rugs, drank my expensive whiskey, and joked about what else they could borrow from my apartment. It was like they thought my home was their playground, and every laugh of theirs only sharpened my resolve. Behind the scenes, I had already spoken with their landlord, a sharp man who didn't take kindly to the idea of his tenants staying somewhere else under suspicious circumstances. He confirmed that their renovations were a lie. They weren't having repairs done at all. They'd simply stopped paying rent on their own place, using mine as a free crash pad while ignoring their obligations. This gave me leverage I could use later, but I wasn't done yet. I started quietly moving some of my most valuable remaining belongings into storage, not just to protect them, but because soon the apartment would become a stage for their undoing. I also changed the locks on the balcony door and the small storage closet without telling them, just to watch their confusion. Lucas, my friend in property management, had lined up a pair of tenants who were eager to move in immediately, and I'd already prepared a lease for them. The only thing left was timing. The final act had to be public, undeniable, and humiliating enough that neither of them could spin it into a sob story for the rest of the family. And so, I bided my time, smiling when Sarah offered me coffee from my own kitchen, nodding when her fiance bragged about managing the place. Inside, I was counting the days. When the 2-week mark hit, I'd make my move. They'd think it was just another afternoon, until the knock came at the door and everything unraveled. The day I chose to end it all was perfectly ordinary for them, which was exactly the way I wanted it. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of lazy, uneventful day that makes people drop their guard completely. Sarah was lounging on my couch, scrolling through her phone, wearing one of my sweaters like it belonged to her. Her fiancé was in the kitchen, rummaging through my cabinets for snacks, humming a tune like a man who believed he owned the place. I walked in casually, holding a small bag of groceries, pretending that my visit was nothing more than a quick stop to check in. They greeted me like I was the guest in my own home, and that alone almost made my blood boil, but I kept my smile fixed. I just need to grab a few things from the closet, I told them, moving toward the hallway. In reality, I was checking my phone for a confirmation message, and right on cue, it came through. "We're here." It was Lucas. along with the new tenants and 2 uniformed officers from the local police department. The officers weren't there to arrest anyone, not yet, but to witness the eviction of people with no legal right to be there. I gave the signal, and within moments, there was a sharp knock on the door. Sarah looked up, confused, and her fiancé frowned, probably thinking it was one of his friends. When he opened the door, his smirk evaporated. The sight of the officers, and Lucas standing there, paperwork in hand, froze him in place. "Good afternoon," Lucas said cheerfully, his voice dripping with the kind of polite venom I adored. "We're here to facilitate the removal of unauthorized occupants from this property." Sarah's head whipped toward me, panic flashing in her eyes. "What is this?" she stammered, standing up quickly. I took my time, walking to the living room, setting my grocery bag down, and looked her dead in the eye. "This," I said evenly, "is what happens when you betray me." Her fiancé started sputtering about how they were invited guests, and how this was unfair. But Lucas calmly pointed to the legal documents, proof that they had no rental agreement, no permission, nothing binding that could save them. The officers didn't need to say much. Their presence was enough to make the room heavy with inevitability. And just to twist the knife, the new tenants were right there, watching silently, holding their signed lease for my apartment. I saw the realization dawn on Sarah. She was being replaced right before her fiancé's eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the rustle of papers as Lucas handed the eviction notice to my sister's fiancé. He didn't take it at first, letting it dangle in the air as if ignoring it would make it disappear. But one of the officers cleared his throat, and with a glare in my direction, he snatched it from Lucas's hand. "You can't just throw us out like this," he barked, his voice louder now, the kind of volume people use when they're desperate to mask fear. Lucas.com, as ever, replied, "Actually, we can. You're occupying the property without the owner's permission. That's trespassing. We're giving you the courtesy of leaving without charges." I watched as the color drained from Sarah's face. Her hands were trembling now, clutching the edge of the couch like it was the only thing keeping her steady. But what made the moment truly delicious was the audience, the new tenants, standing by the door, witnessing every humiliating second, and my neighbor Mrs. Jensen, who had apparently heard the commotion and was now peeking in from the hallway. She was the unofficial news channel of the building. By sunset, every resident would know exactly what had happened here. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. I simply leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching them scramble. "You have 20 minutes to pack up and leave," Lucas added, glancing at his watch. "After that, the police will escort you out, and any belongings left behind will be considered abandoned property." My sister's fiancé muttered something under his breath about how this was going to ruin everything, and Sarah shot him a sharp look, like she couldn't believe he was making it worse. But he wasn't wrong. I had already set the second phase of my plan in motion. While they were packing in a frantic, haphazard way, I stepped into the hallway and made a quick phone call to their landlord, loud enough for Mrs. Jensen and maybe even the new tenants to overhear. I told him about their month-long stay here, the unpaid rent at their actual apartment, and the missing items from my home. I didn't have to embellish a thing. The truth was damning enough. When I stepped back inside, I caught the tail end of Sarah whispering to her fiancé, "She's destroying us." I didn't respond. I just smiled faintly and started clearing out the empty wine bottles they'd left on my shelf, letting the sound of glass clinking into a trash bag be the metronome to their downfall. The moment they realized there was no way to talk their way out of it, the atmosphere shifted from defiance to desperation. Sarah's fiancé began shoving clothes into a duffel bag with reckless force, not even bothering to fold them, while Sarah darted between the bedroom and the bathroom, grabbing whatever she could carry. Every movement they made seemed frantic, unplanned, and tinged with the bitter taste of defeat. I stayed where I was, sipping water slowly, making sure they knew I was watching their every move. Every so often, I would glance at the clock, reminding them silently that time was slipping away. The officers stood by the door, unmoving, their presence heavy and unyielding. Lucas kept his eyes on them as well, checking off items on a clipboard that I knew wasn't necessary but made the scene look even more official. The new tenants lingered in the doorway, whispering to each other, their expressions somewhere between discomfort and fascination. They were seeing firsthand exactly how ruthless I could be when pushed too far. Then, just as Sarah was zipping up her small suitcase, the phone in her fiancé's pocket rang. He hesitated before answering. But when he did, I could hear the faint, unmistakable voice of his landlord on the other end, his tone sharp and unforgiving. I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough. Lease terminated. Pay up immediately. Legal action. His face flushed an angry red as he hung up, glaring at me like I had personally detonated a bomb in his life. I didn't even try to hide my satisfaction. Looks like you've got more than one place to vacate now, I said evenly. Sarah looked like she was on the verge of tears, but I felt no pity, not after watching hours of footage of her laughing at my expense. When their 20 minutes were up, Lucas gave them a polite but firm, "Time's over." They carried their mismatched bags and boxes past the officers, past the new tenants, past Mrs. Jensen, who was now standing fully in the hallway with her arms crossed and a smirk that rivaled my own. As they reached the elevator, I followed them out, leaning casually against the wall. "Oh, by the way," I called out just before the doors closed, "check the local classifieds tomorrow. You might see a story you recognize." The way Sarah's fiance's jaw tightened told me he understood the threat. The doors slid shut, and for the first time in weeks, my apartment felt like mine again. But I wasn't done. They had taken from me, humiliated me, and tried to play me for a fool. Now it was my turn to make sure they never forgot the cost of crossing me. The very next morning, the second wave of my plan hit them like a brick to the face. I'd spent the previous night compiling a neat little package: the security camera, footage, audio clips of their mocking comments, and a detailed list of every single item that had gone missing from my apartment. I sent this package to 3 key places at once: their landlord, who had already been furious, the local police department's property crimes unit, and my cousin, who worked for a small but widely read community blog known for posting human interest stories that often went viral. My cousin didn't even hesitate. By noon, there was a post online entitled "Couple Squats in Family Member's Apartment, Steals from Her, and Throws Parties While She Pays the Bills." I hadn't named them in my own words, but the blog didn't hold back. Their full names were in the story, alongside still images from the footage. Within hours, it was circulating on social media, shared in neighborhood groups, and forwarded by people who loved a good dose of scandal. My phone buzzed constantly, messages from friends, from distant relatives, even from a couple of Sarah's so-called friends who now wanted to distance themselves from her. I didn't respond to most of them. I just watched the chaos unfold. By late afternoon, Sarah's landlord had served them a formal notice for unpaid rent and damages. The police had also called them in for a conversation regarding the stolen items. Not an arrest yet, but enough to scare them. And the blog's comment section was a brutal battlefield, with strangers tearing into them, calling them parasites and leeches. And worse, that evening, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Sarah's fiance had lost a small freelance contract after the client read the blog post and decided he didn't want to be associated with someone who couldn't even respect family. The poetic symmetry of it made me almost laugh. They'd walked into my apartment thinking they were taking advantage of a naive family member, and now, the very walls of that apartment had become the stage for their public downfall. I knew this was just the start. Reputations don't crumble all at once, they erode piece by piece, and I was going to make sure every piece fell exactly where I wanted it to. By the time a week had passed, the ripples of their humiliation had spread far beyond anything they could have anticipated. What had started as a single blog post had now been picked up by a local news channel, complete with a reporter standing outside their old apartment building, describing them as alleged squatters who had exploited a family member's generosity. No matter how carefully the reporter tried to stay neutral, the footage of their belongings being carted out of my building, accompanied by a police presence, spoke volumes. I didn't even have to push the story, it was feeding on itself. Now, with strangers commenting on every public photo they'd ever posted online, dragging their names through the mud, my cousin sent me screenshots of Sarah's fiance trying to defend himself in a community Facebook group, claiming it was all blown out of proportion, but every time he posted, 10 more people would reply with links to the footage or quotes from the blog. Sarah had gone silent on all her accounts, but silence in a scandal like this doesn't protect you, it makes you look guilty. I wasn't aiming for just public embarrassment though, I wanted isolation. I wanted them to feel the sting of doors closing wherever they turned. I reached out, discreetly, to a few mutual friends, making sure they understood the full scope of what had happened: the stolen items, the blatant disrespect, the lies. These weren't exaggerated tales. I had the proof, and people believed it because it was undeniable. Soon, I started hearing that invitations were being lost, that old friends suddenly didn't have room for them to stay, that even casual acquaintances were keeping their distance. Meanwhile, their financial situation was imploding. Their landlord refused to release their security deposit, citing damages and unpaid rent. The freelance gigs her fiancé depended on began to dry up as word quietly spread through client networks. Even Sarah's job wasn't safe. A coworker had recognized her from the blog photos and whispered about it to their manager, who now needed to review her role in the company. All of this unfolded without me lifting more than a few fingers. The beauty of revenge, I was realizing, wasn't in the noise, it was in the precision. You set the pieces in motion, then stand back and let gravity do the rest. And with every update I received about their spiraling lives, I felt the satisfaction of justice being served, one cut at a time. The look on her face when I said those words was priceless. Shock first, then dawning realization, then rage. She stammered something about "you can't do this, it's my home too." But I cut her off with a calm, icy tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "No, it's my property. You've been squatting here, stealing my mail, and even trying to rent out the place behind my back. You crossed the line, both of you." The tenants, now fully aware they had stumbled into a family implosion, stood silently with wide eyes, almost forgetting they were here to see an apartment. I reached into my bag and pulled out copies of the police report I had filed earlier that morning. Yes, I was done playing nice. I handed one copy to my sister, one to her fiancé, and the third I waved in front of them before tucking it back. "This," I said, "is evidence of your trespassing and mail theft. I'm pressing charges. I don't care if we share blood." The fiancé laughed nervously, like it was all some big misunderstanding, but his smirk faltered when I reminded him that I had texted plenty of them where he discussed renting the place out for cash without my consent. The betrayal burned, but the control I felt in that moment was intoxicating. My sister tried to turn the tenants against me, saying I was cruel and heartless for throwing her out. But I reminded everyone in the room that she had been living rent-free for 8 months, ignoring my repeated requests to move out. The tenants exchanged glances, as if silently agreeing that this was not just an apartment showing, it was a front-row seat to someone getting their overdue karma. I picked up the folder containing the signed lease agreement, something I had prepared in advance with the tenants' names already printed on it. "This apartment will be rented starting next week," I said firmly, "and if you're still here, the police will escort you out. Your choice: leave now and keep some dignity, or stay and face legal consequences." The fiancé muttered under his breath, but my sister's silence told me she knew I was serious. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one being manipulated, was the one in control, and I wasn't letting go of that power. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had trouble sleeping, but because my mind was buzzing with the next phase of my plan. I knew I couldn't drag this out forever. The tenants I'd brought that day were still interested in renting the apartment, and part of me wanted to close that deal just to spite my sister and her fiancé. But before that, I had something far more pressing: the final blow. I drafted an email to every single one of their friends, colleagues, and extended family, a calm, calculated letter explaining exactly what happened, supported with the timeline, the photographic proof of their illegal entry, and yes, a few choice screenshots from texts they'd both forgotten existed. My tone in the email was measured, almost detached, because I knew that would hit harder than any emotional outburst. I presented it as an unfortunate incident that I felt morally obliged to clarify to avoid misunderstandings. By lunchtime, I started getting replies, some of them expressing shock, some trying to confirm if it was true, and others sending me their own stories about the two of them. It was like a dam breaking. Apparently, they'd been pulling similar, manipulative stunts with other family members and acquaintances for years, but no one had stood up to them until now. The part that really made me smirk, though, was a forwarded email I received from one of the fiancé's business contacts. He had withdrawn from a major deal with him, stating plainly that a man who treats family like that can't be trusted in business. That single sentence was worth more to me than any revenge plot I could have imagined when this all started. And yet, I wasn't finished. I had one last move planned, the kind that doesn't just burn bridges, but ensures the other side can't even swim back across the river if they tried. I knew my revenge needed a public stage. something big enough to make my sister and her fiancés feel the sting of humiliation that they had so effortlessly given me. Renting out my apartment was no longer the goal. It was about making sure they could never pretend this never happened. I started by reaching out to every mutual friend, distant relative, and even old neighbors we hadn't spoken to in years, under the pretense of organizing a special family gathering at my place to celebrate my supposed big life decision. The hook. I hinted that there would be a surprise announcement involving my sister. Naturally, curiosity spread like wildfire, and RSVPs came in faster than I could keep track of. At the same time, I made sure the apartment's state of disrepair from their little secret would remain untouched. The unwashed dishes, the pile of clothes, the empty wine bottles, and most importantly, the lease documents they had carelessly left on the coffee table with my sister's forged signature scribbled across my name. I also arranged for the couple who had originally come to see the place, the rightful tenants, to be present, so their shock and anger could become part of the story. Every move was calculated. Every call, every text was a piece of the trap tightening around them. The more I planned, the calmer I felt, as if each step was scrubbing away the helplessness I had felt when I first opened that door and saw them there. By the night before the gathering, I had even hired a discreet videographer to record the entire event. Not for some cheap online stunt, but so that, years from now, if my sister ever tried to rewrite history, I could hit play and remind her exactly what she had done. This wasn't just revenge, it was reclaiming my dignity. One perfectly timed detail at a time. The day of the gathering arrived, and the air in my apartment was thick with anticipation. People trickled in, smiling, hugging, and whispering about what the big announcement could be. I had set the stage perfectly, chairs arranged facing the coffee table where the incriminating lease documents still sat. The blinds open to let in the glaring afternoon sun so that every stain, every wine ring on the table, every dirty plate left behind was impossible to miss. My sister arrived last, walking in with her fiancé, as if she owned the place, wearing a smug little smile that told me she assumed the event was in her honor. She was dressed to impress, in a glittering dress that caught every bit of light, her arm looped through his as though they were the most admired couple in the room. I greeted them warmly, the picture of a gracious host, even though my stomach twisted with the effort it took to keep my tone sweet. Once everyone was seated, I began with a small speech about family, trust, and how sometimes the people you love most can surprise you in ways you never imagined. My words were carefully chosen, laced with just enough ambiguity to keep them guessing. But each sentence edged closer to the truth. I gestured to the coffee table and said, "Today, I want to share a real-life example of what betrayal looks like." The room fell silent. I stepped aside so everyone could see the papers, the mess, the disarray that wasn't mine. I told them the story from start to finish, how I'd returned to find my sister living here behind my back, how she forged my signature, how she planned to rent it out for her own profit. Gasps erupted around the room, eyes darting from me to her, and back again. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fiancé's hand slipping from hers as the weight of the stairs pressed down. This was it, the moment the spotlight burned her instead of flattering her, and I made sure it stayed there. In the end. As I stood on the balcony of my apartment that I had fought to reclaim, I realized this revenge had never been about simply getting even. It had been about reclaiming my dignity and my place in a family that had long underestimated me. My sister's face, once smug and superior, was now drawn and sullen, a mirror of the reality she had tried so hard to ignore. Her fiancé had left her weeks after the humiliation, claiming he couldn't be with someone who carried so much baggage, which I couldn't help but laugh at, because in truth, the only baggage she had left was the shattered reputation she built for herself. The tenants I had originally planned for the apartment had moved in, paying me double the rent I initially intended after hearing the bizarre story behind it. They said living there felt like being part of a legend, and I, for the first time in years, felt an unshakable sense of power, not because I had hurt my sister, but because I had refused to be silenced or sidelined again. The whispers in the family about how I went too far didn't bother me. They only reminded me of how far I had been pushed before I struck back. In the quiet of that evening, as the city hummed around me, I poured myself a glass of wine and toasted not to revenge, but to self-respect, something far more satisfying and lasting. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter 1, in which I would never again allow anyone, family or otherwise, to take what was rightfully mine.